Everyone to this seminar, to our research seminar series. So really happy to have Kez McCormick speaking here. So Kez originally is from Australia actually, but I think love drew him into Sweden a long time ago. So Kez is an associate professor at Lund University, works at the IIIE Institute, which is in a way very similar to what MSDI is. So it's also an institute around environmental, I think it stands for environmental economics at the end, but it's much broader than that. And it's an institute which also sits not within a faculty. So we're just slightly discussing all the challenges that come with that. Kez is an interdisciplinary researcher, background in political science and environmental science, and really working across a whole range of different kind of topics. So the things that you will talk today about is mostly a large program, a Sharing Cities program, which is part of a much larger program in Sweden around viable cities. But also, I think, as you will talk a bit about other projects you're developing and working in, so including the Natureovation project. We had Harry Bilkley, you might remember, as one of the first speakers, and Kez, like me, is one of the collaborators in this project. Kez is also honorary fellow at the MSDI Institute, our colleagues at Malmö and Umeå. So that's including his family, but that's what brings him occasionally to Melbourne. And finally, last but not least, Kez has known John Thwaites from when he was a very small child, because his father and John are good friends. Anyway, Kez, the floor is yours. Go ahead.
God, well, that's the best introduction I've had for quite a while. You actually listen to what I talk about as well. He knows everything. Yeah, fantastic. I thought I would sit down and present. It feels a little bit more like a conversation. We feel like a good audience for that. As Rob said, my name's Kes McCormick, and I'm an associate professor at Lund University. I spend a lot of my time explaining why an Australian would be living in Sweden. The Swedes are fascinated by why an Australian would move from Australia to Sweden. It doesn't compute in their heads. For them, Australia is a fantasy land, a luxurious country of warmth and friendliness and so on. So being an Australian, I know, it's amazing, isn't it? They know everything great about Australia and ignore anything else. But the Swedes do really see Australia as a fascinating place. It's very easy being an Australian in Sweden or in Europe. We have a fantastic reputation. But I've been working in Europe now, living and working in Europe for now 20 years. I love Sweden. Working with sustainability and innovation in a country like Sweden is slightly different to Australia, as you might imagine. It's incredible the investments they make and the programs they have. And this is just one example of the kinds of investments you see in Sweden. Really large investments, long-term thinking. They also make investments into things on the periphery, you might say, like sharing. Into areas where they think might be part of their future economy or might be part of the global future economy, and wanting to explore and understand these areas. So it is a great place to work. I'm also very pro-European. Whatever you hear about Europe, Europe's a wonderful place, amazing. I mean, I don't know how you left Europe. I mean, I travel around to all these different universities and cities and centres and meet all kinds of people and so on, working in all kinds of fields. So I find it an exhilarating place to live. At the same time, I do come back to Australia regularly. I think Australia is actually a very important country when we talk about global sustainability. Even if we talk about, we can ignore the last election, but actually Australia is perhaps the first industrialised country that will feel the full impacts of climate change. Across agriculture, cities, various industries, we'll get hit with just about everything. And I think how Australia reacts and responds to that will be a big signal to the rest of the world, actually. And even, we were just talking before, I do think Australia is ripe for change and ripe for innovation, even though, again, the last election might not suggest that. We could discuss that over a beer later, but I do think Australia, and when I talk about Australia in Europe, I do often talk about this, that Australia is almost the canary in the coal mine. We're almost the country that's going to tell the rest of the world what's going on and how bad or good it could be. But yeah, so today I'm going to talk about Sharing Cities Sweden, and I'm in fact the program coordinator for this national program in Sweden. I think the Swedes are still a little bit confused why they did fund an Australian to lead such a program. I lead it slightly differently to other Swedes, but It's a national program around the sharing economy in cities. With about 120 million Swedish crowns invested, it's about 12 million euros over 3-4 years. And it's the kind of investment where the Innovation Agency is trying to provide a boost of investment into an area to kind of explore and evaluate and perhaps direct that area and so on. You almost got the name of my institute right. I work at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics, the longest and most confusing name ever created for an institute, and possibly the worst acronym ever, IIEE. IIEE. This is about 20 years old, this institute. We're very similar to the MSDI, that we're kind of independent from the university. Our founder created the name because he realised that politicians in Sweden were incredibly impressed but had no idea what we were actually doing, which gave him great freedom to design the kinds of things that we were doing. But the ideas behind the institute were really built on advancing sustainable solutions. And the idea of working with solutions meant that we would definitely analyse problems and understand problems and challenges, but then move very quickly to what do we do about it. And if you're interested in what do we do about it, then you need to work very closely with industry and with government. And this is a really strong foundation of our institute. You need to be interested in working with heavy industries, you know, the dirty industries, the ones that we might say, ooh, why should we be working with them? And in Sweden, that can mean industries like forestry, agriculture, mining, things like that. But it can also mean working with all kinds of innovation, other kinds of industries which we might consider more innovative and more smart and more clean tech. But very much a lot of work with industry. And also then a lot of work with government at all different levels. Because the basis of our thinking is essentially that without legislation, it will be very hard to shift and shape our economies. Legislation provides very strong signals to the economy. And so I've been working in this place for actually about 20 years and essentially been doing a lot of work around urban development in this time, a lot of work related to cities and so on, and the kinds of companies and government policies and so on which relate to cities. So what I thought I would also say before I keep going is I can talk for a long time. I'm an Australian, no problems talking. The Swedes love it. And I can just talk and talk and talk about the things that I find interesting, which you might also find interesting. But if you have questions, you might as well ask them as we go, because then I'll talk about the things that you find interesting. So just interrupt me whenever you want, okay? And no silly questions. You can ask me anything, and I will attempt to answer it. But I thought I would just start by talking to you about the projects that I'm involved in, because my work is essentially around cities and city governance and so on. And I think the projects I'm working on perhaps give a pretty good reflection of some of the major areas of work in Europe. The European Union provides enormous amounts of funding to different projects. And so these ones here, I think, a good picture of what's happening in Europe. But what I can also say about cities, straight off, okay? Cities are fantastic. Cities are going to be really important to transformation, but national legislation, national government, or European governance is hugely important. So in the Swedish context, the national government is providing all kinds of strategic investment down into the cities, into Stockholm, into Malmö, into Gothenburg. So it's not like the cities are doing this by themselves. The cities are perhaps the change agents, but fully supported by national and, let's say, European government or governance. Another slight difference from the Australian context. But this is something which is important to recognise. So, for example, Rob and I are part of a project called Naturevation. You need to come up with fancy names as well for European projects. I think that's the same in Australia. On cities, nature and innovation, which is about essentially recognising that we're facing a changing climate. Cities are going to be hotter, drier, wetter, all kinds of new conditions which are going to challenge city systems, you might say, and that nature-based solutions or greening cities and bringing water into cities is one major response, and that this will also result in us having to rethink cities, spaces in cities and the city's relationship with nature. So technical, social, natural systems being connected or reconnected, you might say. And in fact, one of our case studies was Melbourne. actually. And I was just recently at the Melbourne Museum at the launch of Living Melbourne, the Living Melbourne launch, about a metropolitan strategy for urban forestry, which is actually super impressive and a very ambitious strategy. And I think here's an example of a city of Melbourne in particular, but all the other councils around, who really do have a strong evidence base about things that are going to happen in Melbourne, like heat, increasing temperatures in the city, like a lot of the trees dying and so on, and what that would mean for the cities to not have canopy cover and so on, and then reacting to that knowledge, which is actually really quite impressive and gives, again, a sense of that Melbourne and Australia are actually on the forefront of many of these issues. Because in Europe, absolutely, there are urban forest strategies, but not as advanced as the one that Melbourne is at least presenting, and how important it will be to Melbourne. Because essentially, if we're talking about Melbourne, the evidence tells us in Melbourne that if you increase the temperature 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees, people will actually die on the streets. You will actually have deaths associated with increasing temperatures. That's a pretty good policy driver. That gets politicians to do stuff generally, being very blunt. So this project is really a fascinating work, and I think that we're going to see more and more around the world and in Europe investments into this area of greening cities and kind of our changing thinking about infrastructure in cities. And Rob and I are trying to write an article on this. Rob's leading it. We might be finished in a couple of years. We'll see if we manage to get there just in time for when it's all happened. We've also been working in many other projects. This one's called GUST, on the governance of urban sustainability transitions, which was looking into urban living labs and looking into sites in cities or precincts or districts, spaces in cities, which we use to kind of conduct experimentation, social and technical innovation. So we try to kind of boost something in the city. So an example would be in Malmö. They took a district in Malmö and said, this district's going to be 100% renewable energy, ultra efficient buildings, we're going to take away all the car parks and we're going to see how it works and learn from that. Or you can have all kinds of temporary experiments where you might say, close off a street for a while and take away the cars and see what that street would be like without cars in it. Those kinds of things are kind of happening all over Europe. And then there's now questions around how do we take that kind of experimentation and feed it into broader impacts and so on. And then this program, Sharing Cities Sweden, is part of something called Viable Cities, a very odd name. I'm not sure how the Swedes came up with this. It sounds better in Swedish. Viable cities, I suppose we all want to live in a city that's viable, but this is about smart, sustainable and attractive cities, an enormous innovation program spread over 12 years, which essentially distributes money to cities and organisations in Sweden to work on, well, exactly what we said, smart and sustainable cities. Interestingly, Rob and I were just talking before, the program kind of started with a very strong technical and engineering focus, and there's a lot of work around infrastructure and the technical side, but in fact the vast majority of questions are around governance and financing and the human experience of cities and you name it. So a lot of social sciences in there. And again, I think the Swedes are really trying to create livable, sustainable cities, but they're also very pragmatic, the Swedes, and this is what people often forget. They are thinking very much about how do they sell their know-how, knowledge, technical solutions to China and India. It's that simple, because the Swedes know if you come up with something that works in India and China, presto, you're looking good from an economic perspective, aren't you? So they are very pragmatic as well. They're not just thinking about being global citizens. They have a very strong business focus, which I think can actually be a good driver in a lot of these areas and so on, but it also makes them think about solutions that might not just work in Sweden, but can also work in other contexts that might be very different. And finally, another project called Transform, which is about small businesses and entrepreneurs and their role in sustainability transitions. Because often we forget these kind of small companies and small players. They kind of become a bit invisible in these transitions, at least in the research field. And it's trying to kind of lift them up and kind of ask the questions of what are they doing, how can we support them, and so on. So that's just like a quick kind of reflection on a bunch of projects that I'm working on. I could speak about them for a long time. But then the sharing economy. So what a buzzword. Whew, everyone loves sharing. We're jumping into it in big ways. And in Sweden, this program has adopted a very broad definition for sharing. And here's like a typical definition we might see, that the sharing economy is about offering innovative solutions for sharing, renting, replacing underutilised assets, often using digital platforms, ICT, that informs about supply and demand. It can be everything from sharing tools and toys, sharing cars, sharing space, you name it. There's a lot of things happening in this space. There are dozens of definitions. I could talk with Darren about this, but I mean, there are all kinds of definitions. And I think that this is a very broad definition. And in this program, we've decided to kind of allow anyone in who thinks they're working with sharing to understand how they're working with this idea. For me, like, two things jump out immediately with the sharing economy. One is about kind of ownership and access. The sharing economy is all about that shifting that space, shifting from maybe a world where we have a great amount of ownership, where we own a lot of things, to a world where there is far more access rather than ownership, or a mixture of both. This is not like good or bad here. You can have all kinds of complications and contradictions in this space between ownership and access, but it certainly is a bit of a fundamental shift in perhaps the way we are organising our economy at the moment. You also see immediately this kind of platform economy perhaps versus the collaborative economy. So the platform economy is all about creating these platforms that might facilitate sharing. So Airbnb and Uber are examples of platforms. So Airbnb is the biggest accommodation service in the world that doesn't own a single building. Perhaps they own their offices. I'm not sure, they might rent them. And Uber is the biggest taxi service in the world but doesn't own a taxi. That's a big shift from the way companies are perhaps organised in the past. But the collaborative economy is asking questions about, okay, are these commercial interests going to deliver the kinds of world we want, perhaps, or the kind of outcomes we want? So, and these two things can work together, platform and collaborative, but they can also be in contradiction with each other. But hang on a minute. We're living in a world which is facing a few crises, aren't we? And we're even calling it the climate crisis now, or the climate emergency rather than climate change. And in Sweden, in Europe, and I think around the world, I think you've maybe heard about Greta. Greta is a 16-year-old schoolgirl from Sweden who said, I've had enough. I'm going to start striking just by herself. We live in a bizarre world, don't we, where one person can go on strike and yet the whole world can know about it. But essentially she's saying we need transformative action. And she's kind of perhaps sparked something or connected to something which is, you know, all over the world. And we're seeing young people, adults, protesting all over the world for something bigger to happen. And I think it's important when we talk about this sharing economy or pretty much anything around sustainability, how does it fit into this transformative action? Because Greta's also talking about here that she doesn't want to hear anyone talking about hope anymore. We don't need hopeful statements. We need action, essentially. She's talking about panicking here. I think panicking without a plan is not such a good idea. But if you've got a plan, then you can panic. You can do things about it. But I think it is very, very important for all of us who work in this field to think how what we're doing fits into this transformative action. At the same time, I see out on the wall, and just about everywhere I go now, the Sustainable Development Goals. They're so colourful and they're up and they're everywhere. And I'm surprised. I'm amazed that so many organisations have connected into these goals and are using them. And I think that in all the meetings and things that I'm involved in, I think there's a lot of genuine interest in applying these goals, measuring these goals, and really trying to use them to guide development, which I think is really positive. Whether we can do it or not is another question, but I think the commitments are there. But when I look at these goals, I like this diagram because it highlights the biosphere, society, and the economy. It has partnerships right down the middle. I mean, this is not rocket science, but without partnerships within sectors and across sectors, we just won't meet any of these goals. But at the same time, what strikes me about all these goals is consumption patterns. You know, if we don't change consumption patterns, it's going to be very hard to meet any of these goals. And this is where the sharing economy starts to come in. Because I think that for me, the sharing economy starts a conversation about consumption in a perhaps a positive way as well. So, I mean, clearly, if we take a positive view on the sharing economy, we can see that it certainly can potentially contribute to a variety of sustainability goals, but different sharing services and sharing organisations contribute in different ways. It's clearly offering up kind of some kind of alternative economic model. It's kind of trying to rethink systems of production and consumption, or can certainly impact those. And it is gently challenging, actually, kind of political, economic, social and technical systems. I mean, you're shifting power in a way through the sharing economy, which is very interesting. Now, we could debate all these things for a long time, but this is why I think it's interesting to work with the sharing economy, or this is why in Sweden they're making these kind of investments, because they can see that this is a way to work with consumption. Because consumption is very tough to work with in the world we live in, ultimately.
Go back to the previous slide. When you talk about, this one. When you talk about this sharing economy on this slide, which sharing economy do you mean?
Which sharing economy? It's a good question. Well, in this case, in this national program, we're taking a very broad perspective on the sharing economy. So we're basically including everyone who thinks they're working with sharing. And so what we're saying is in this program, what we're trying to work out is which parts of the sharing economy, which organisations, which setups contribute in which ways to these kind of goals. The big challenge here is, I mean, we can see that some parts of the sharing economy would appear not to contribute to sustainability goals. So Airbnb and Uber, it looks very iffy if they really are making any kind of environmental sustainability contributions. Whereas some other parts of the sharing economy, these are really quite positive. We can see kind of contributions here. But what we see in a lot of our work is it's not so much about maybe, let's say, a tool sharing schemes in Stockholm. I was talking to Darren before. The tool sharing scheme in itself is not that interesting in terms of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But what we're looking into is if someone engages in tool sharing schemes, does it affect other lifestyle choices and other consumption choices? And what we kind of see anecdotally is yes. So you start to share a bike or share a tool or sharing a car is a big one. So that's the most obvious. But when you engage in one part, then all of a sudden you start to rethink other consumption choices and lifestyle choices. And that's where you can have the impact, it seems. Not the actual, just the sharing of a tool, not buying a power tool, if that makes sense. And I mean, well, the other, and I'll come into that more as well, kind of the role of infrastructure and urban systems in shaping our urban lifestyles is huge. So if you live in an apartment building, so in Sweden, in one of our areas, which I'll just jump to now, in Malmö, they're kind of rethinking an urban development project and thinking about how you would facilitate sharing. So in other words, if you create a district where you put the parking lots in a parking hub, so away from the houses, but you allow the shared cars to be right in front of your building and the shared bikes right in front of your building, guess what? People use car sharing and bike sharing. And then they're putting in rooms into the apartment buildings for tool sharing, clothes sharing, toy sharing. I mean, to basically experiment and investigate what happens when you do this. Can you actually change the whole lifestyles in this area and so on? And again, the kind of results we're getting from the evaluation work we're doing is that yes, absolutely, you shift these infrastructures and you shift people's lifestyles. So yeah, that's very, very important to the sharing economy, that we facilitate the sharing economy. And it's probably the car sharing is the most obvious, where once you start to get people out of owning cars, even sharing cars, they use the sharing service less, much less than they would have when they owned a car. They moved to bikes and they moved to public transport and other kinds of ways of getting around. But all the infrastructure has to be in place to allow that to happen. So in Melbourne, you couldn't just put a car sharing scheme out here and think that everyone's going to use it if you haven't got everything else around it, in other words.
Just based on your work, and you'll probably know that as well, I mean, there's certain types of people that participate in the sharing economy, because I reflect on myself, you know, and it won't be a shock. No, actually, I'm not going to reveal that much detail, though. No, but I'm curious about, because I'm also about, you know, scaling, you know, and, you know, based on what you're discovering, are there certain types of people that participate in that, and there are others who don't? Yeah. And how does that have implications for scaling principles of sharing economy?
Yeah, I mean, this is something, again, I've been having these conversations. I mean, one thing is that a lot of these, like, services, let's say bike sharing schemes or community gardens with food sharing and toys and so on, a lot of them are scaling, a lot of them they don't want to begin with, they don't want to scale. The actual initiative doesn't want to get bigger. It actually functions at a small scale. So and replicating is not easy either, but it is about kind of creating these small initiatives and networking them in different ways. So there's that one side, but then this other side around, I mean, what we really see, like if we take the car sharing one, you can actually shift quite people who you wouldn't have thought by changing urban infrastructure and urban systems to make the default choice car sharing and public transport. Yeah, you shift people into that. And I mean, and we also see in a Swedish context that there is a changing, that young people in Sweden are less and less interested. Owning a car is not like part of your character and who you are anymore. In fact, it's the opposite. So there's other things that are, which is kind of, but this is very contextual. This is like Swedish young people. I mean, this is like not easy to replicate, but we see that kind of, so the urban mobility area is the one which seems to be really quite, that there's disruptive changes happening in it. I mean, electric vehicles are coming, driverless cars are coming in a big way, we think, in Sweden, and then there's kind of car sharing around that. So it all connects together. Because, I mean, that's the other thing that's kind of coming in, now I'm jumping around, is that driverless cars, I mean, in Sweden, the debate around that is no one's going to own a driverless car. Or individuals are not going to own driverless cars. Companies or organisations will offer this service, and you'll pay to utilise that service. And, I mean, that's just a radical shift from our current setup, obviously. Whether this comes about or not, I'm not sure, but this is the kind of thinking discussions that we see in Sweden. And most people or experts in Sweden are talking about 5 to 10 years with driverless cars, you know, appearing and so on. So that's kind of a rapid change.
Not how it happened, but I'm just realizing I don't necessarily understand what we qualify as a city when you're talking about urban spaces. So I'm just wondering, and I've just moved regionally, so I'm just wondering how do we kind of quickly and gently sort of describe what we're talking about and where these kinds of programs get rolled out?
I mean, it's a good question, absolutely. So where should I start with? I mean, in this program, so I can start. So this program as such, but I'll answer your question by going through this, is very much around Sweden actively and critically engaging in this area, space, goods and services mobility and systems, and we've identified 4 major cities which we're working with as test beds. These are Stockholm, which is the biggest city in Sweden, Gothenburg, Malmö and Umeå. Gothenburg, they're all different sizes. Stockholm's about 1 million, Gothenburg about 500,000, Malmö about 300,000. These are small cities in a global sense. And then Umeå like 100,000. Umeå is a really important part of this because it is a small city. And in fact, one of the issues you have in Sweden is the way they understand a city and which cities are important. And so you would think if you were in Stockholm that everyone lived in Stockholm, in Sweden. But in fact, only 1 million people live in Stockholm in Sweden. You've got 9 million people living outside of Stockholm. And in fact, the most important cities or towns are the ones that are 100,000 or less. And it's in those places which are super interesting. So I don't know if I'm kind of answering your question, but what I'm saying is we're actually, so in the Swedish context, it's kind of from Stockholm to these smaller ones. But in fact, a big part of our program now is about we call them small towns. It's a terrible way to describe places, but places with smaller populations. How does the sharing economy work in these places, and how would the Swedish Innovation Agency support those smaller places? Because it's very different to Stockholm. And that also goes back to your question about replicating and transferring knowledge. What kind of things can you transfer from Stockholm to other places, or who can transfer what to where? And typically the experiences in Stockholm is so context specific to Stockholm, it's very hard to transfer. Whereas if we work with these other smaller places, it's easier to transfer knowledge and experience and lessons from them. So, and I think this actually goes for a hell of a lot of sustainability work on cities, that it's smaller cities that are far more important and more interesting to be working with. So we actually have, part of our program is actually just on small towns and how the sharing economy works there. And it is our first impression is very, very different. Because it's, particularly in the Swedish context, they're not talking about Airbnb and Uber, you're talking much more about the collaborative economy than the platform economy. Good questions. Now I'm kind of thinking how I should go from there. So I can just go, like, this is also interesting in terms of cities and replication and learning and so on. The structure of the program, so the idea that there are 4 test beds, so larger kind of investments in these 4 cities, Malmö, Stockholm, Gothenburg and Umeå, in different parts of Sweden, and that we're trying to really kind of push them together. And so they're all completely different, doing completely different things, related directly to their context. So what's important in their places. But then we're trying to have a lot of kind of interaction and learning processes. They are sharing experiences and things they're doing, and that organisations are moving from one place to another and so on. That colour's obviously terrible to read on. But essentially what they're also working with is kind of testing and evaluating and trying to establish these kind of feedback loops, these learning loops within the city as well, and across the different cities. So then, to be more concrete, more specific, so what is actually happening in these places? So in Malmö, They're working with a place called Sega Park, which is exactly what I talked about changing infrastructure or rethinking property development to facilitate the sharing economy, and essentially working with the building developers and the property developers to do that. And there's a lot around car sharing, space sharing, and creating spaces for the sharing of goods and services, like tools and clothes and toys and so on. And so this is actually under development now, and I suppose in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, it'll all start to be implemented and kind of evaluated to see how it works. In Stockholm, it's more working with a district there which has got really high sustainability and energy and climate goals, and working out how does the sharing economy support that. And in fact, in this case, so in Stockholm, like again, they've got an area which is essentially 100% renewable energy, high energy efficiency buildings, trying to reduce the use of cars. So essentially what you hit in terms of trying to reach your goals is consumption. And so then the question is, can this sharing economy help to shift consumption patterns in these places? And I mean, yeah, I mean, when we're talking, I mean, this is really high consumption. So, you know, compared to other parts of Sweden, other parts of the world. And in Gothenburg, what we see is a city with a huge number of grassroots initiatives. So things coming up from below, bubbling up from below, and the city government and our work there trying to facilitate them by creating kind of smart maps, online maps to facilitate people knowing about all these initiatives. So essentially, and then trying to connect these initiatives so they're kind of learning from each other and trying to work out if they can replicate or scale them or take them to other places and so on. And then Umeå, like I said, is really interesting because it's a smaller town and it represents, you know, basically many other small towns in Sweden. And then in fact, if we can get things to work in a place like Umeå, or to work out, you know, what kind of things we can facilitate there or what works well there, we can replicate that or use it in many, many other cities in Sweden. And I'm very un-Swedish. I regularly in Stockholm saying that Sweden is not Stockholm. The people in Stockholm get a bit offended by that. But essentially, and I think the same goes here in Australia. That's also an election thing. You know, Australia is not Melbourne and Sydney. You know, we might wish it was living here, but it's not. So if you can't relate to these other places and work with them and so on, you're going to have a hard time, well, being in government or working out how to get sustainability off the ground. And then we have a variety of kind of cross-cutting. Yes?
Very practical question. You go with all these small towns. Do people commute from there into the bigger cities for work, or do they actually work there as well?
They do. So the Swedish government regularly invests into these smaller towns and trying to definitely get industry located in them and also putting universities in them and putting government agencies in them and so on. There is still absolutely people commuting. I mean, Stockholm is still a big place where people are employed and have their jobs, but I would say most people that live in these towns, although I wouldn't know the percentage, are working in them as well. So they're not commuting. I mean, because again, I mean, Sweden is a big country, a bit like Australia. I mean, these are big distances between these places. So it's more, and the sharing economy is also seen as a way to kind of, create, you know, to support and create lively and livable and attractive places to be as well. So there's a lot around that as well. So people are not so much commuting into Stockholm from these smaller places, no.
Is that part of the case for government involvement in this program? Like,
yeah.
Sort of interest, like,
in Australia, I would imagine, you know, Bunnings would look at a tool library and go, what the hell?
Yeah.
Why are you spending government money on that in this thing that will ultimately take money away from our shelves?
Yeah.
I guess another area government might be a bit ambiguous about is sharing economy being used as a cheer squad for tech entrepreneurs to ignore regulatory frameworks and go do a bunch of harmful things. So what's different about Sweden that you have major government investment in something like this where, I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't work here, but everything I've seen here in Australia is very grassroots up, not top-down supported. So what's going on there?
What is going on? I know I got asked, I actually have given this, I've been asked this question, I don't know if I've got the answer. There is a lot of strategic investment from the national level in Sweden, absolutely. Strategic investment coming down into these cities and so on to support them. I mean, a lot is around creating livable and attractive cities and so on, so a lot around the public benefits and so on. But there is, you're right, about the tool libraries, there has been that discussion in Sweden as well. You know, these tool libraries are a direct, you know, competition with, you know, suppliers and so on. They're trying to sell tools and so on. So there is, I mean, I think at this stage, these schemes are not large enough to be seen as a threat, but their potential is absolutely like a disruption in these industries and so on. But I mean, I don't know. The Swedish system is a fascinating system, but there is a lot around that. This is just part of investing in society, basically, and making it a better place to live, essentially.
Related to that, has there been pushback from more traditional?
So, kind of related to that, has there been pushback from more traditional industries such as manufacturing and retail for projects?
Yeah. It's interesting, like in Sweden, many of these projects, like this one, we've got about, I think I wrote there, 50, 60 partners. There's all kinds of industry involved in this project. And then we're part of this Viable Cities project, which is even larger. And that's just basically all industry. This is kind of everyone's in there. So, and they're in there because in Sweden, I think there's a great awareness that the economy, it's a small country, it's got a small economy, and it doesn't have a lot of heavy industry and fossil fuels. Its economy has to be constantly changing, constantly at the forefront. So if they're not at the forefront, then where are they? You know. So there's kind of a sense of that. So there's this kind of sense that all these companies are there, part of these conversations and part of this innovation work. That doesn't mean that in the background they're not working in different directions and so on. But they're all at the table and part of these discussions. And I suppose the sharing economy, it's not considered a huge threat yet, and it's kind of also seen that it's also beyond Sweden. It's like it's coming. It's coming. You know what I mean? So it's not. It's like it's a wave that's coming. It's more like how do we in Sweden work with the sharing economy or adapt it and shape it in ways that work for us. But at the same time, I mean, absolutely, there's corporate interests and commercial interests here that see some parts of these things they don't want to happen, but other parts they see it's happening and they need to be part of that change. But I think this is also in Europe as well. Like, I mean, just for example, let's just take energy companies in Europe. I mean, many energy companies in Sweden, I mean, they fully know that they're going into renewables and energy efficiency and so on, that coal and fossil fuels is starting to drop away. It doesn't mean they're not in those industries anymore, but I mean, if you sit in those companies and meet those people, they know what direction they're going, you know? So there's, even at that level, there's really strong awareness of a renewable energy transformation and things like that.
Just to jump in there, it's all about
Sorry, there you go, that's better. Sorry, it's also, Kez, not a zero-sum game. So, like, people don't look at, the local library and go, oh, they're going to put bookshops out of business. So that's right. I guess we've got to look at how sharing communities come together at that really local level to build resilience and create thicker community connections and social capital. And so, and it can also be new combinations of technologies. Like a lot of public libraries now have libraries of things where they are enabling you to rent out various tools and other electronic equipment and so on, but also they're becoming maker spaces, so you can learn new skills for the new economy. You can repair broken goods, start repair cafes. So it's innovation at a different kind of level and a different way of looking at innovation, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And that whole that's another thing which is appearing in Sweden, this whole kind of repair economy, repairing things. There's all these kind of repair cafes being set up to repair your mobile phones, repair computers, repair bikes, you name it. I mean, that's just also, and that's part of this kind of sharing economy bubbling up as well, which is all part of this kind of changing face, you might say.
So just a query as well in regards to Sweden. Is it also because, this is still a socialist country?
In some ways.
Maybe not so in the last 10 years, but interesting because as well, even, like housing, it's considered as one of the basic human rights where it's sort of even shared for housing or public housing that's different from here, where no one owns their own washer and dryer because it's a social thing to also be doing your laundry in the common areas as well. How have they also discussed how replicable that is? Because there's a huge cultural component to the Swedish culture and some of these test beds.
Yeah, the whole property sector in Sweden is heavily regulated, and so there are no investment properties. You can't go and buy an apartment and make that your investment property. You have to live in it. So of course that changes your whole property sector. And then in a lot of apartment buildings in Sweden back in the 60s and 70s, they created shared washing rooms in the basement, so you wouldn't have to have a washer and dryer in your apartment. And that, of course, is a huge, you might say, cultural establishment in Sweden, but at the same time, it's also just that they changed an infrastructure and then the culture went with it, you know. So I think what Sweden also highlights very much is if you change the systems and infrastructure in which people live, you change lifestyles actually quite easily, you know, without much difficulty at all, really. And I suppose this sharing city Sweden is also continuing to explore that and so on. But yeah, there is definitely, I mean, Sweden is definitely built on the idea of socialism as well. I mean, I think that when I first came to Sweden 20 years ago, I think it was even stronger, and I think it has weakened a bit. But there's no doubt in Sweden there's some kind of belief. There's two kinds of belief. One is that if Rob's better off, I'm better off. So you kind of look at your neighbour, you go, if he's good, I'm good. That's a big thing. The other thing is that if you say you're going to cut taxes, they assume you're going to cut services, and that's not good. So if you come out and say we're cutting taxes, we're slashing taxes, like they're slashing services, whatever you do, don't vote for them. I mean, these are just huge things in terms of governance. I mean, you know, this has changed a little bit over time, but they're two very strong kind of social.
It's like the upside down in Stranger Things.
Exactly. It's kind of like we're kind of the reverse of that, I think. So, I mean, it's not entire, but it is strong. So.
But I suppose that brings it to like what are the intended outcomes you're trying to track across these different examples, and equally how are you tracking unintended outcomes and, you know, surprises in it? Yeah.
I mean, the great challenge with this work on the sharing economy, because we've been kind of tasked with evaluating it and trying to make sense of the impacts and some of the intended outcomes, unintended outcomes, and surprises and so on. And we started the project by essentially arguing that there was no one evaluation approach we could use. And so we've actually adopted dozens of evaluation approaches across all these different sharing services. And now we've got the challenge of trying to make sense of that. The challenge with consumption, and with trying to evaluate changes in consumption, is it is so difficult. Like, what is changing in consumption and so on, and what happens if someone consumes less tools? How do they then use the money in other ways and so on? And I suppose one of the real, the crux of the issue here in Sweden is that even if we get everyone sharing things, so if we get them all into sharing cars, sharing tools, sharing toys, they're going to save money. And then, as I said, in the dead of winter, most Swedes will get on a plane and go to Thailand for a week. So if we facilitate that at a massive scale, then we're probably not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the key thing here is to actually reduce overall consumption, not just shifting consumption with still everyone having the same amount of wealth. And how we do that, I'm not entirely sure. It's a big challenge for a country like Sweden, really.
You're putting me in mind of...
Because I'm almost conscious.
Yes, sorry.
10 minutes.
Yes.
Are you okay with the question, or are you rather go to some of the other stuff?
I'm getting sick of the questions, but no, we continue with the questions. The questions are excellent. I love the questions are good. Stop him from asking them. No. The questions are great. Continue with the questions.
It was actually a helpful suggestion.
A helpful question.
I mean, you're probably aware of Ferguson's work in Denmark on spillover and behaviours, and talk about positive and negative spillover. And I think I understand Sarah. I don't know if she's here, but Sarah, one of our colleagues here, is pretty deep in this stuff. But I understand one of the things you're really looking for there is behaviours that people perceive as being similar are more likely to have positive spillover between them. So I guess that might be something to think about in, you know, what practices are each of these different interventions raising that are similar, that could lead into different domains and greater impacts.
Look, the more I work with this, the more I'm kind of interested in the fields of behaviour change and so on, and how lifestyle changes and so on, and how this connects and so on. But I think one of the big kind of messages that we're giving to Vinova and so on is that changing urban infrastructure and urban systems can have great impacts on how we live and consume in our cities, which is probably something we knew already, but we can show very clearly from many of these cases that, you know, you just shift a few things and change a few things, you can change the way people live quite significantly. And I think the Swedes are already aware of this, but confirming that. And then also a lot around what small towns and small cities need to kind of be working with consumption and so on. And so actually up here, so we funded like 5 other projects, and around kind of business models, the type of business models that we need to kind of have in place to kind of be stimulating the sharing economy, around like sharing communities. What happens when you create communities of sharing? Because this is also really important when we think about sharing and consumption, that to create a sense that it's not just me doing it, but there are other people doing it and we're part of something. You know, this is clearly important. Sharing towns, we've already talked about that, a whole project around that. Behaviour. Here, really looking at behavioural economics, using that as an approach to understand sharing. And finally, around digital platforms, we've got projects around that, essentially around how to support the digital platforms for more the collaborative economy and so on, rather than the Airbnb and the Uber and so on, but other kinds of sharing. Yeah, and then here I've just basically got a slide up here. I mean, basically what I see happening in this program, this kind of messy and complex program, is it just helping a hell of a lot of rethinking about sectors and so on. So in the mobility one, the car sharing, it just creates all kinds of rethinking about mobility. You can see it happening in the cities, and particularly in Malmö and Stockholm and all of these places, basically rethinking how we're going to get people around cities in other ways, and not by everyone owning a car. The space one is probably also very complex, around about rethinking spaces and co-locating services and functions. This can also be from like an apartment building to like a whole district and so on. But the whole space issue is more than just the sharing of space. There's so much happening in cities around space and so on. And then goods and services I talked about. I mean, here it really is about the ownership and getting into kind of the last of this overall consumption, the relationship between those. So, I mean, this kind of program is, in a way, very fluffy in the sense it's just kind of opening up a space for kind of rethinking and talking about these kind of rather difficult issues of consumption. And then hopefully leading towards some very robust policy advice for Vernova and so on. But what we actually have coming up right now is kind of all feeds into this, but this is kind of like the key thing that we're really bumping into is, you know, okay, sharing economy, sharing cities, lots of parts of it look quite exciting, but can we couple this to kind of the Sustainable Development Goals, or how does this link and relate to some of these Sustainable Development Goals? So if Vernova was to decide to make large investments into small towns and the sharing economy, how would that connect into meeting their Sustainable Development Goals and so on? So we are jumping on the Sustainable Development Goals bandwagon as well to try to connect into those. It's also now become very relevant to the funding agencies and government and agencies in Sweden to understand that connection. So if they're going to make large investments, how does it connect back to these goals? So I would thoroughly recommend to continue along the Sustainable Development Goals line as a way to guide development. And that's basically it. I mean, I think for me, like the sharing economy as such is part of something much bigger. And I think what in these sharing cities that I'm working with in Sweden, these test beds, it is opening up some kind of window of opportunity to kind of step a little bit into the future and think about consumption and how we can shape consumption in different ways. And I think that is so important and exciting. I mean, we must tackle consumption in like meaningful and difficult ways. And unfortunately for many people, when I talk about consumption, maybe in this room, but people think, oh, we're going back to the Stone Ages, we're not going to own anything, won't be able to fly anywhere. I don't think it means that at all, but it definitely means some kind of difficult conversations about somehow constraining or shifting our consumption patterns the way they are. Having said that, I just flew all the way here to Australia to tell you this. But apart from that, and it was a shared aeroplane, I suppose. I was sharing with other people, but there are a few difficulties like that. But I do think that this is a really important conversation and an area to engage in if we're interested in sustainable development. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. So we have a couple of minutes, I guess, left for questions and further comments. I'm also aware that people on Zoom might be asking questions, so get people to think a little bit about that. I have one question for you, Kez. I think you mentioned a couple of times the importance of changing infrastructures as a way of changing behaviors and lifestyles. Doesn't that then come down to the question who owns and controls the infrastructures?
Yes.
And might that be actually different in a country like Sweden compared to a country as Australia and many other countries where, if you look back, probably also in Sweden, many of the public infrastructures have been privatized. Yeah. So it is actually much more difficult now than it was 30 years ago to change infrastructure. So how does that play into your story?
I like his questions. No, absolutely. You're totally right. And I mean, this is also, I mean, obviously this program is we are focused very much on Sweden in the Swedish context, but we have been looking around and collaborating with a few other countries, the UK, Japan, even Australia and so on, getting a sense. And I mean, I think, this is a real issue, that we have kind of given up control of infrastructure in many ways, in many places. That's a bit problematic, absolutely. But for me here, I mean, this is fundamentally important. The way we design cities, obviously the urban systems and the urban infrastructure, if we design that in the way to facilitate sustainability lifestyles, I mean, that's the key. And I mean, sometimes this is big changes, this is really significant shifts in infrastructure, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it can be quite simple shifts and so on that aren't major investments and so on, but are still kind of shifts in thinking around infrastructure. But when it comes to consumption and when we look in this kind of project, it's so fundamentally clear that the infrastructure either makes sharing a possibility, makes it the default choice, like it's the first thing you do, or makes it the absolute last choice. And I mean, those three areas are a huge influence on if you're engaging in sharing. So for example, in Malmö now, they're setting up a shopping centre, a sharing shopping centre, in the middle of Malmö, which will all just be sharing services and shops. Do you think people in Malmö are going to be engaging in sharing? Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, so it's fundamentally important, and that's probably not a big infrastructural shift, but it'll be a big mindset shift for Malmö to suddenly walk into a shopping centre and try to buy something and say, no, sorry, we're just sharing here. I mean, so that's, I don't know how it's going to work out, but it's going to be different.
I just want to look at Zoom. Is there any questions on Zoom?
This was a really good talk, by the way. I like the sharing tools, especially it means if I can reclaim a shed that has been filled by my partner.
Yeah, that's right.
This is a question from Shirin. What are the specific research questions that you're investigating in these projects, and what are you trying to understand through the Urban Lab?
So, I will answer that in an email. So, I mean, overall, this is an innovation program. So even though I'm a researcher leading, my job is not so much at that level, but broken down inside the test bed, absolutely there are research questions and different approaches. But I think better that I supply that in another format than me trying to go through all of it.
You think Rob and I on that?
Yeah, I can send it to all of you and so on. So, but essentially what we decided at the start of the program was that there was not one approach to evaluating and understanding sharing economy in cities, and that we needed to adopt a whole array of approaches, and then to kind of have a mosaic of findings coming back in. And that's both good and bad from a research perspective. But I think what we're doing is learning a lot about specific services in different places and then trying to make sense of it as a whole. Having said that, I mean, there's a variety of other projects, international research projects on the sharing economy and sharing cities, which are pure research projects. And I mean, I think there's one called Urban Sharing, which is also from my institute. I think they have very specific questions about institutionalisation, which are really interesting about how you institutionalise sharing in different contexts.
Yeah. Two more questions. Try and keep them short. I think, Amy, we should be leaving the room a bit early, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so try and keep your questions short. And yeah.
More just a quick, thanks so much, Kez. Just a quick couple of comments about infrastructure. I think maybe there's an opportunity here in Australia around industry super funds, potentially, because there's trillions of dollars washing around in our superannuation system, and it's growing all the time. And industry super funds are looking at, investing in infrastructure. So maybe there's like a public good kind of story we could tell around this. And also, bigger developers are also trying to appeal to, new market segments and offering various shared accommodation. Like Nightingale in Melbourne is a good example of that happening at a residential level, but some of the bigger precincts are looking at co-working and shared kitchens and shared social spaces and so on. And I love what Malmö is also doing with infrastructure for sharing, making and repair.
Yeah.
So that's also, again, about new skill acquisition and transition to like new economy, new jobs kind of thing too.
Yeah.
More comments than questions, but yeah.
Perfect.
Which I'll take as well.
first time I have to say I'm already sold on Sweden because they have some of the best. They have some of the best circular fashion researchers in the world. So the Future Fashions Group is part of leading the charge, I think, as far as research on sustainable fashion. So I'm actually curious because I think I've learned an incredible amount from you today. Is when you're looking, I'm interested in the fashion clothing sector, obviously, but when you're looking at the size of cities, the balancing of innovation with infrastructure and engagement across all of these projects, and particularly on a consumer sector like fashion, it's very innovation driven at the moment, and it's less about behavior change, which actually I think needs to shift. So what are the sort of sector trends, and how do you then package up sort of the programming across, food, cars, consumer goods, toys? Do you start to see within these kinds of programs real trends as far as where is the heavy hitting investment going and where do you have to rebalance, and how do you kind of match up sort of the responses to that with the complexity that's already there?
Yeah, just a small question to finish off. Small answer.
Sorry.
No, very, very short. I think several things. I mean, I think the Sustainable Consumption Centre in Sweden is doing really interesting work on this, and that's very recent. And I think they've got, I can't remember, consumer goods. It's fashion. There's several sectors. I think that would definitely, I can give you some more information about them if you don't already have it. I mean, in our work, the one where we see the strongest trends is transportation, the car sharing and mobility. That's where there's a lot of investment flowing into that. The electric, driverless and shared vehicles are considered, the future. So that's where there's a lot of investment going in. I think in the other sectors, I think what I would do, I will share with you some material on those kind of things, but there is a lot of research going on, and I don't have it on the top of my head, but I think they are definitely establishing kind of trends and looking at what's happening and potential areas. And I mean, for example, in the furniture area, IKEA has all of a sudden started to show an interest in repairing, can you believe it, and sharing. And this is yeah, and that's doing it. And that's a clear example of a very big company deciding there's something happening over here, this little corner, and we would like to be part of that conversation and possibly shape that as well. But it's really exciting as well that such an enormous company would take that as something important and so on, and potentially expand into it. So yeah. But let me get your email and share more things with you for sure.
Thanks a lot, Kez. That was a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I should just finish by saying I am like a walking advertisement for Sweden, so it may not be exactly